when the rain stopped. The rain had fallen for 40 days and 40 nights. It was not just water that came down from the sky. It was judgment. It was sorrow. It was the final word spoken over a world that had refused to listen. And then, it stopped. The ark, once tossed by towering waves, now rocked gently to a standstill. Its massive frame groaned against the sudden stillness, settling upon the crest of a nameless mountain. No more thunder splitting the skies. No more howls of fear from the outside. No more chaos. Only silence. A silence so heavy it pressed down harder than the floodwaters ever did. A silence that was not peace, but something closer to a weight. Thick, invisible, inescapable. Noah, the man who had walked with God, who had obeyed without question, who had heard the voice of heaven while the earth rebelled, now heard nothing. No commands. No encouragement. No explanation. Only the whisper of the wind threading through the broken clouds. Only the creaking of timber beneath his tired feet. Only the wild, stunned breathing of the creatures inside. There was no celebration inside the ark. No shouts of victory. No songs of deliverance. There was only the ache of survival. Noah looked out across the endless sweep of gray. The waters still cloaked the earth. Somewhere beneath that mirror lay the ruins of cities, of homes, of dreams. Somewhere, the cries he could not forget still echoed in his mind, voices pleading for a second chance that never came. And now, here he stood, not as a triumphant hero, but as a man stranded between two worlds, the one that had been judged and the one that had not yet begun. The rain had stopped, but the storm inside him had just begun. Every plank of the ark carried the sin of salt and sorrow. Every beam was a memory of hammering nails with hands trembling from exhaustion, a memory of gathering animals with a heart heavy from farewells. And now, those same hands hung limp at his sides. There were no more instructions to follow, no more tasks to complete. The great mission was over, and the silence after obedience was more disorienting than the chaos ever had been. What do you do when the voice that guided you falls silent? What do you hold on to when the storm outside has ended, but the storm inside has only deepened? Noah did not know yet. He only knew that the rain had stopped, and somehow, the silence felt heavier than the flood. What do you think is the greatest danger humanity faces today? Share your thoughts below. Your voice matters. The heavy silence. The ark stood motionless, a solitary vessel adrift on a world reborn and ruined at the same time. Inside, there was no noise, no instructions, no fresh word from heaven. The voice that had once thundered with clarity was gone. Noah had grown used to divine direction. Build the ark, gather the animals, enter before the rain begins. Every step had been commanded, every nail driven by obedience. But now, nothing. Noah waited. He waited for the familiar stirring, the unmistakable certainty that God would speak again. He waited for guidance to descend like rain from the clouds. But only silence met him. The silence was not cruel. It was not angry. It was something deeper, something heavier, a silence that made the heart question itself. Noah paced the length of the ark, his feet echoing in the vast emptiness. He watched the animals shift in restless sleep, heard the soft breath of his family huddled in corners. Life clung to him, but direction did not. The silence stretched into days, then into weeks. The absence of command became its own kind of command. Wait. But wait for what? Noah did not know. Faith had once meant building an ark while the skies were still clear. Now faith meant standing still when heaven was silent. It is easy to trust when the path is marked by fire and voice. It is harder to trust when the path disappears altogether. Noah, the man who had trusted before the rain, was now called to trust after it, when there were no blueprints, no warnings, no timelines. The silence forced him inward. It unearthed questions he had buried under the noise of construction and preparation. Was he still chosen? Was he still seen? Had the mission ended, and with it, the favor of God? Noah had survived the flood, but survival came with a price, the terrifying vastness of uncertainty. He had been the captain of salvation. Now he was a wanderer on a sea of stillness. The ark that had once been his purpose had become his prison. And yet, he remained. Noah stayed inside the silence, because there was nowhere else to go. No voice to follow. No alternative to choose. Sometimes, the greatest act of faith is not in moving forward, but in standing still. Not in hearing, but in waiting to hear. And so, Noah stood in the heavy silence, listening, hoping, believing that even the silence had a purpose, even when it crushed him. Mission completed. Now what? The mission was finished. The flood had come and gone. The ark had served its purpose. Noah had done everything he was commanded to do, and yet, he felt more lost than ever. There is a strange emptiness that follows great victories. A hollow space where purpose once lived. A silence that feels louder than the loudest storm. Noah stood on the deck of the ark, staring into a sky that no longer raged. His hands, once calloused with the labor of salvation, now hung uselessly at his sides. There were no more animals to gather, no more planks to hammer, no more warnings to proclaim. The world lay before him, empty and silent, a blank canvas that offered no clear image. What do you do when your life's greatest calling is behind you? How do you live when the one thing that gave you meaning is complete? Noah had saved humanity, but no one had told him how to save himself from the void left behind. The days dragged by, one sunrise after another, each more aimless than the last. There was no new assignment, no divine spark lighting the way forward. Just existence, just breathing, just waiting. The silence was not simply external anymore. It had seeped into Noah's soul. It sat there, heavy and unmoving, a dull ache that no amount of faith or memory could erase. He had prepared for the flood. He had not prepared for life after it. And in that endless space between purpose fulfilled and purpose rediscovered, Noah realized something terrifying. Sometimes, surviving the storm is not the hardest part. Sometimes, the hardest part is surviving the silence that follows. Memories that do not fade. The rain had stopped, but the echoes of it had not. Noah could still hear them, the cries from beyond the walls of the ark, the pounding fists, the voices pleading for mercy when it was already too late. Those sounds had not been washed away with the flood. They clung to him, invisible and heavy, stitched into the very fabric of his mind. At night, when the world outside fell into a haunted kind of stillness, Noah would close his eyes and the memories would surge like a second, darker flood. Faces he had once known, friends, neighbors, entire cities swallowed by rising waters. No matter how hard he tried, he could not silence the images. They floated before him like shadows, distorted, unreachable, accusing. Noah had obeyed. He had trusted. He had built what he was commanded to build. But none of that silenced the memory of humanity's final screams. No covenant, no rainbow, no fresh earth under his feet could erase the terrible knowing. He had lived when others had not. Survivor's guilt was not a word then, but it lived in him, unnamed and ferocious. He could still smell the salt in the air, not from the sea, but from the tears of a world drowning in its own rebellion. And deep inside, a question he could never voice began to rise. Was it worth it? Was survival enough when it came at the price of every familiar voice, every comforting place, every ordinary day that would never return? Noah walked the empty decks of the ark, each footstep a reminder that sometimes the hardest storms are not the ones outside, but the ones that memory leaves behind. And those storms do not pass quickly. They settle in the heart and stay, long after the skies clear. When obedience turns into endurance. It is easy to obey when there is a task to complete. Easy to move when the voice of God is clear and urgent. Easy to follow when the road is marked, even if the road is hard. Noah had obeyed. He had built when no one believed. He had warned when no one listened. He had stayed faithful when the world laughed at his faith. But now, there was nothing left to build, nothing left to warn, nothing left to prepare. And it was here, in this strange, silent aftermath, that obedience changed. It was no longer an act of doing. It was an act of enduring. It is one thing to hammer nails into it with a mission burning in your chest. It is another thing to stand still with empty hands and a heart full of unanswered questions. Faithfulness in motion had been his rhythm. Now, faithfulness meant standing in the vast, unmarked plains of silence, not moving, not building, not knowing. To continue obeying without new instructions required a different kind of strength. Not the strength to act, but the strength to endure. To hold fast without proof. To believe without hearing. To wait without understanding. Noah realized that the real test of faith was not in the building of the ark. It was in the endless days that followed. When heaven seemed closed. When earth seemed foreign. When even his own heart seemed tired of believing. And so he stood, not as a builder now, but as a silent witness to a faith that chose endurance over clarity. This was the obedience that no one saw. The obedience that writes itself not in deeds, but in the quiet refusal to let go. even when everything in you wants to. A new world without a map. When the waters finally receded and the door of the ark swung open, the world that greeted Noah was not the world he had left behind. The ground was bare. The skies were unfamiliar. The air itself seemed hollow, stripped of all the scents and sounds that once gave it life. There were no towns, no markets, no laughter drifting from doorways, only emptiness. The earth stretched out in every direction, wide and unclaimed. It should have felt like a new beginning, a chance to start fresh, to rebuild. But it didn't. It felt foreign, alien, as if Noah had stepped into someone else's story. He walked cautiously across the barren land, each footstep stirring up dust from a ground that remembered too much. Everywhere he looked, there was no past to anchor him, no familiar landmarks, no memories to cling to. Only the sky above, vast, silent, and strangely heavy. Noah was not alone. His family was with him. But even among them, he felt the ache of isolation. No one else could remember what he remembered. No one else had seen the old world swallowed whole. No one else carried the same weight in their bones. He was surrounded by life, and yet utterly alone. It is a strange kind of loneliness, to stand at the edge of a new world and realize you no longer belong anywhere. He could plant vineyards. He could build homes. He could teach his children how to survive. But he could not rebuild the life he had lost. There was no map for this place, no familiar roads to follow, no traditions to guide them. Only the long, aching silence between the earth and the sky. Starting over looks beautiful on paper, but in practice, it is a slow kind of grief. A grief not just for what was lost, but for the parts of yourself you realize will never come back. And so Noah moved across the strange, scarred land, not with the boldness of a pioneer, but with the careful, aching steps of a man who knew that survival always costs more than it seems. In this new world, hope would have to be built from the ashes of everything he had once known, and Noah carried those ashes with every step. Broken inside. The earth was clean. The air was fresh. The danger of the flood was gone. On the outside, everything looked safe. But inside Noah, the storm had never really ended. Safety is a strange thing. It can surround you on every side and still leave you feeling exposed. Noah had survived the destruction. He had outlasted the judgment. He had reached the other side of history. Yet his soul carried wounds that no clean sky could heal. The ark had protected his body, but it had not shielded his heart. The waters had spared his family, but they had drowned something deeper inside him. Grief lived where gratitude was supposed to be. Emptiness settled where joy was meant to grow. Noah smiled for his sons. He gave thanks with his lips. He moved forward with his hands. But deep inside, something fragile had cracked. There are wounds that no celebration can mend. There are losses that no fresh start can erase. The flood had taken more than just the wickedness of the world. It had taken the world itself, and the sense of belonging that came with it. Every new day on this fresh earth was a reminder that something irreplaceable had been lost. And though Noah stood on solid ground, his soul still floated, adrift in memories he could not silence. Safety had come, but peace had not. And Noah learned what many learn after the storm. Survival is not the end of the battle. Sometimes, it is only the beginning of another, quieter war. One fought not against waters or enemies, but against the silent ruins left inside your own heart. Faith in the silence. Faith had once been a roaring fire. It had built an ark in the face of ridicule. It had prepared for rain when the skies were clear. It had endured the rising waters without trembling. But now, faith had to become something quieter, something heavier. There were no new promises, no fresh visions, no whispered reassurances from the heavens. Just the endless days of waiting. Faith in the silence feels different. It is not carried by emotion. It is not fueled by excitement. It is a slow, deliberate choice, made again and again with every silent sunrise. Noah had to believe that God was still there, even when he said nothing. He had to trust that obedience still mattered, even when there was no visible reward. Faith was no longer about building something visible. It was about standing invisible. It was about planting seeds into soil he did not yet know how to love. There were no signs to follow, no voices to chase, only the long, aching silence between prayers. And yet Noah stayed. He stayed when the land felt foreign. He stayed when his heart felt hollow. He stayed when heaven stayed silent. Faith in the silence is not glamorous. It is not dramatic. It is the kind of faith that heaven treasures, the kind that keeps standing when everything in you aches to sit down. And so Noah lived one silent day at a time, holding on to a promise he could no longer hear, but still believed had been spoken. The rainbow and the silent heart. One day, after countless silent mornings, something changed. The sky, once heavy and gray, broke open with a different kind of light. A ribbon of color stretched across the heavens, delicate yet fierce, a band of brilliance woven through the clouds. The first rainbow. It was not born from human hands. It was not crafted by hope or prayer. It was a gift, a covenant, painted across the broken sky by the hand of God Himself. No more, it said without words. Never again, it whispered across the winds. It was a promise sealed in light, that the floodwaters would never again swallow the earth. That destruction would not have the final word. Noah stood and stared. His heart recognized the beauty, the mercy in it. But inside, the silence remained. The rainbow spoke of peace, yet Noah's soul still ached with the scars of what had been lost. Sometimes, even a divine promise cannot erase human sorrow. Sometimes, healing does not arrive as quickly as the sky clears. Noah believed God. He trusted the covenant. He knelt in gratitude. But gratitude and grief are strange companions. They can live side by side in the same heart. They did in his. The rainbow arched above him, a bridge between heaven and earth. But Noah felt the deep valley still inside himself, the place where memories lingered, where unanswered questions nested. The world was being rebuilt. The soil was ready for planting. Life was beginning again. But Noah carried with him a landscape that no rain could wash clean. A geography of loss, mapped across the hidden places of his heart. The rainbow was real. The covenant was sure. But so were the silent tears that still sometimes came at night. So were the long moments when he looked across the horizon and searched for something familiar, and found nothing. The rainbow was a sign from God to the world. But inside Noah, the work of healing was slower. Because even when heaven sends a new beginning, the heart sometimes needs longer to catch up. The vineyard. When words failed and skies grew quiet again, Noah turned his hands to the earth. He planted a vineyard. It was a simple act, ordinary, unremarkable compared to the towering miracle of the ark. But there was something desperate woven into that soil. Planting vines was not about survival. It was not about rebuilding society or securing the future. It was about finding something, anything, he could control. After so much chaos, after so much loss, Noah needed something predictable, something that could grow under his hands, where the process made sense. Seed, Sunday rain, harvest, a quiet order in a world that no longer felt ordered. The vineyard was not rebellion. It was retreat. It was the silent language of a soul trying to steady itself. A soul that had witnessed too much and needed something small, something tangible, something that would stay rooted when everything else had been torn away. The vines grew slowly. The leaves stretched toward the sun. And Noah watched them with the weary eyes of a man who understood that not all healing comes through fire and thunder. Sometimes it comes through the quiet persistence of planting hope into broken ground. But even here, beneath the green canopy, sorrow clung to him. Because planting something new does not erase the pain of what was lost. It only gives the hands something to do while the heart aches in silence. The fall after the flood. One day, the vineyard bore fruit. The vines, tended with tired devotion, offered their gift. Noah gathered the grapes. He pressed them. He made wine. It was innocent enough at first. A simple joy. A harvest of labor in a world still trying to remember how to hope. But sorrow is patient. It waits beneath the surface of celebration. Noah drank. And then he drank again. And somewhere between the second and third cup, the weight he carried found a crack to slip through. The man who had survived the wrath of the flood now crumbled under the silent flood within. Noah became drunk. And for the first time since the ark was built, he fell. He fell not to water, but to weariness. Not to rebellion, but to exhaustion. He lay uncovered in his tent, stripped of dignity, stripped of strength. The man who had once stood tall before a world bent on destruction now lay vulnerable before the quietness of his own pain. There is no heroism in this moment. No grand speeches. No glorious victories. Only a man, broken by survival itself. It is easy to judge a fall. It is harder to understand the silent, invisible battles that lead to it. Noah did not abandon his faith. He did not curse his God. He simply collapsed under the unbearable weight of memory, grief, and loneliness. And in that collapse, the story of humanity took a new and sobering turn, that even the most righteous are not beyond breaking, that even the strongest hands can tremble when the work is done, that even faith does not make a heart immune to sorrow. Noah survived the flood outside, but the flood within was harder to escape. The scandal of vulnerability. The tent was quiet. The air inside was thick, not with judgment, but with something worse, exposure. Noah, the builder of the ark, the survivor of the flood, lay uncovered and vulnerable, stripped of the dignity that had once clothed him better than any garment. And it was in this moment, not in the storm, not in the flood, but in the fragile quiet, that the true test of those around him emerged. Ham entered the tent first. He saw his father's nakedness. He saw the fallen state of the man he once revered. And he did not turn away. He did not cover the shame. He carried it outside, turned it into a story, a spectacle. Honor faltered. Respect cracked. A wound deeper than the floodwaters was carved in that moment. Because vulnerability invites one of two reactions, compassion or contempt. And Ham chose contempt. But Shem and Japheth chose differently. When they heard, they did not rush to stare. They did not speak. They acted. They took a garment, placed it on their shoulders, and walked backward into the tent. Step by careful step, without looking, they honored their father's brokenness. They covered what was exposed, not with judgment, but with grace. Their silence spoke louder than Ham's words. Their reverence mended what Ham had torn. There are moments in life when someone's weakness is exposed before us. When we see the cracks in the heroes we admired. When we glimpse the human frailty we thought was not there. In those moments, we reveal who we are. It is easy to honor strength. It is harder to honor brokenness. It is easy to celebrate victories. It is harder to guard the dignity of someone who has stumbled. Shem and Japheth understood something sacred. The fallen are still worthy of honor. The broken are still worthy of covering. And so they walked backward. They shielded what should have been shielded. They covered what the world so easily exposes. In a world eager to exploit weakness, they chose instead to protect it. In a single, quiet act, they showed that true strength is not in revealing failure, but in covering it with love. And in that tent, between shame and honor, between contempt and compassion, the seeds of future nations were sown. Not by victories, not by triumphs, but by how they responded when dignity hung by a thread. Wounds that echo across generations. When Noah awoke, the air around him felt different. Heavy, bruised. He learned what had happened, not from God, not from visions, but from the whispers of his own household. And something inside him, something raw and wounded, broke loose. Noah did not curse Ham directly. Instead, he spoke a curse over Ham's son Canaan. "Cursed be Canaan," he said. "A servant of servants shall he be." It was not a calculated judgment. It was the anguished cry of a father whose dignity had been torn apart. It was pain speaking, not prophecy. And pain, once released, rarely stays contained. The wound Noah carried spilled into the next generation. The shame he suffered planted roots into the soil of the future. Canaan had done nothing, but he bore the weight of a moment he did not create. This is the tragedy of unhealed wounds. They echo forward. They stain what comes after. They turn personal grief into generational struggle. Noah's words shaped history. Nations would rise and fall around the bitterness born in that tent. The Bible does not sanitize this moment. It does not excuse it. It simply records it, a brutal reminder that even the righteous can leave scars. Pain, left unattended, becomes inheritance. And sometimes, the loudest curses are not spoken by God, but by broken hearts too weary to heal before they speak. In Noah's story, the flood waters ended, but the flood of woundedness would ripple through his lineage for centuries. Because some storms do not end with rainbows. Some storms are passed down in names and memories and unseen scars. The man who faded away. After the vineyard, after the fall, after the curse, Noah quietly faded from the center of the story. There were no more great commands, no more astonishing acts of faith, no more dramatic interventions from heaven, just the slow, steady passing of years. The man who had once stood alone against the world's corruption now lived in the background of a new world he barely recognized. He was no longer the builder of salvation. He was no longer the preacher of coming judgment. He was simply a man, older, quieter, carrying the silent weight of survival. The Bible records no final words from Noah, no triumphant farewell, no grand tribute. Just a line, brief and simple, and he died. And life moved on. New nations rose. New stories were written. Noah became a shadow on the edge of history, honored but no longer seen. It is a hard truth. Sometimes the greatest acts of faith are not remembered loudly. Sometimes the ones who carried the heaviest burdens leave the quietest echoes. Noah had done what was asked. He had endured what no one else could endure. He had obeyed when obedience cost everything. And yet, his ending was not filled with applause. It was filled with silence. A silence not of shame, but of completion. The kind of silence that falls after the final note of a long, hard song. And maybe that is how it should be. Because the truest faith does not demand recognition. It simply lives, breathes, obeys, and lets God hold the memory of it forever. The final record. The world forgot Noah, but heaven did not. Centuries later, when the writer of Hebrews sought to list the heroes of faith, Noah's name was there carved into eternity. By faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7. No mention of his failure. No retelling of his drunkenness. No reminder of his curse. Only faith. Only obedience. Only the memory of a man who trusted when trust seemed foolish. Heaven remembered the best of him, not the worst. This is grace. This is how God writes history. When the world sees collapse, heaven remembers courage. When the world tallies mistakes, heaven treasures obedience. Noah's final record was not the vineyard, not the shame in the tent, not even the silence after the flood. It was the faith that built an ark when there were no clouds in the sky. It was the courage to listen when no one else would. It was the perseverance to keep building, board after board, when every voice around him mocked and doubted. And even though his last days were marked by invisibility, his legacy was not lost. God saw, God remembered, God honored. Not because Noah was perfect, but because he was faithful. Sometimes the loudest testimonies are built in silence. Sometimes the greatest victories are marked by scars no one else can see. Maybe Noah's fading from the spotlight was not a tragedy. Maybe it was a final act of faith to keep living even when there was no clear mission, no grand assignment, no burning voice from the sky. To live by quiet endurance is no less holy than to act with bold courage. Noah reminds us that faith is not just about starting well. It is about standing firm when everything grows quiet. It is about holding fast when your hands are tired and your heart is bruised. It is about believing that God's memory of your obedience is stronger than the world's memory of your failures. And so, Noah's life whispers to every soul who feels forgotten, you are not forgotten. Heaven records the hidden faithfulness. Heaven honors the quiet endurance. Heaven writes the names of those who stand when no one sees. You are not defined by the moment you fell. You are defined by the grace that covered you and the faith that kept you breathing when the rain stopped falling. If this touched your heart, help share this. Like, comment, subscribe, not for numbers, but so this message reaches someone else who needs it.